Okay, thanks very much for the warm welcome. It's really great to be back here at MacDevOps. I think it's been 5 years since the last time I was here. And, you know, in pandemic time, that's 84 years. So it's really nice to be back. My name's Katie, and I work on the Jamf product team. And I'm here to talk about declarative management. And Joel actually set me up. He doesn't know, but he set me up for a really good kickoff to this conversation. Because not xenomorphs. Nor bees. Sadly, I missed that memo. He was talking about how declarative management is sort of new and doesn't do a whole heck of a lot yet, but I'm here to tell you about why you should start getting excited about it, because it's going to get cool. And so I'm not going to talk so much about the what, because Apple has a bunch of resources about that already, but really focus on the why, because I live in product and that's what we do. So because declarative management is such a significant change, there are plenty of smart people who have had plenty of interesting things to say about it. And that is going to frame my conversation today. So I'm actually going to bring you things that people have said about declarative management and kind of talk through, like, are they on the right track? What the heck are they even talking about here? And so, and then I'll wrap it up with some thoughts about WWDC. But we'll talk about why is declarative management so different. We'll talk through some real world use cases. Joel alluded to it, but new things are hard. We have uncovered some interesting things while rolling out declarative management. And then finally, those bits, problems that start to go away. And then the stuff that we learned just a couple weeks ago that were totally worth jamming into a conference session that was going to be just 2 weeks later. So we'll cover some stuff. For the folks in this room, I'm betting that you have a really decent amount of exposure to the guts of device management as we've historically known it. Probably pretty familiar with its limitations, if only because you've been trying to do your job around those limitations for a long time. So what I've noticed thus far while I'm talking to admins about the vagueness of declarative management and the kind of a complete overhaul of the MDM protocol is that they don't necessarily know why they should be excited about the new hotness. And this is a paraphrase, but it's pretty close to what was actually said in a conversation where I got in a call with a couple admins, and they're like, we are stoked about declarative management. And I was like, great, talk to me about what problems you're going to solve with it. What are you looking to uncover with declarative management? And they're like, I don't know, it's new and we need it. And that's just kind of how things are in IT. I mean, let's be real. A lot of times you don't have full control over the things that have to be enabled. Somebody somewhere, whether it was InfoSec or an executive or somebody else said, do the new thing, ship the new OS, whatever it is. So you kind of have to adopt it, even if you don't necessarily know all the working parts in the background. You kind of have to adopt the latest and greatest technologies. And really what I want to do is give you a feel for why this particular latest greatest in technology is going to be super valuable and the problems that you're going to be able to solve with it. And so I'm going to start by briefly talking through sort of legacy or traditional MDM as we've historically known it and why declarative management is so fundamentally different. And this quote on the screen is one of my favorite things. It comes to me from a coworker of mine in Jamf's customer success organization who described traditional legacy MDM as like telling my 4-year-old to get dressed in the morning. And I love it. And now not everyone is a parent. I'm not. But I do remember being a little kid who definitely resented when grown-ups tried to tell me what to do, especially with my clothing choices, because let's be real, I had that on lockdown. So somebody telling me how to get dressed in the morning, not my favorite thing. So let's dig into what my coworker was really talking about here and with this comparison. And so we have to think about what MDM has been, what we're used to. And to simplify things a lot, MDM is a set of commands and queries, right? So the command might be update your operating system, or apply the setting to connect to your organizational Wi-Fi, or install these managed apps. And then the subsequent query might be, what's your operating system right now? Or tell me what apps you have installed, or did you apply that Wi-Fi profile? And because network traffic happens and downloads take time, as an admin doing real work and trying to understand the current state of devices, you might ask again and again if that thing that you care about has actually happened. How about now? Or maybe I'll check again tomorrow. So in traditional MDM, we'll get an acknowledgement when commands have been received or completed. We can get a lot of information back from the device when we ask, but we do have to ask repeatedly. And we get a lot of duplicative information back repeatedly. And if you're queuing up traditional or complex or conditional workflows, you're asking for a lot of information a lot of times. And then you're asking your management server to ingest and parse that information, possibly do calculations against it, possibly then trigger resulting commands and resulting queries and resulting polling over and over and over. Finish the cycle there. Basically, legacy MDM is very, very chatty and can require a lot of resources, especially for organizations at scale. So that gets me back to the 4-year-old. Hey kid, go get dressed for school. Maybe the kid comes back in a shirt and shorts, but it's below freezing outside. Or maybe the kid comes back with shoes and no socks. Depending on the kid and the complexity of the instructions you're giving, you might have to provide frequent guidance. And it's cold, go get a sweater. Or hey, socks first, then shoes. Every time the kid comes back from the room, you have to check, did they do that thing that you were expecting? This is that notion of verbose frequent polling. Traditional MDM, it's expensive. It requires a lot of attention and a lot of inspection to actually see, did you do the thing that I asked you to do? Did you actually install that app, apply that update? How about now? How about tomorrow? Now with declarations, we actually get to take advantage of way more detailed upfront instructions that tell the device how to behave under a certain set of conditions. And then that set of instructions combines with status reporting to alert the management server when certain values have changed on the device. So rather than that frequent polling and verbose responses and reactive MDM actions based on what the device eventually reports in response to those queries, the management server can simply compose a set of instructions, send that to the device, then the device can behave autonomously without nearly as much traffic back to the management server, without nearly as much calculation-intensive behavior on the management server itself to tell the device what to do next. So in the language of the declarative protocol, you provide configurations, predicates, and activations. And once populated with all that information, the conditions under which it should behave, the client just kind of takes care of it. That's sort of the ideal state. And I'm definitely straining the metaphor a little bit here, but declarative management is much more like a reasonably functional teenager than a little kid. So they can figure out when they should wear a jacket outside. Whether or not they do is actually a different question. It might depend on their own set of predicates, like whether or not there's somebody cute at school that they're trying to impress. But the instructions have been delivered and can be autonomously acted upon. That's the foundation of declarative management. And Joel already referred to this, but it's been a slow roll, right? We first saw it in WWDC 2021 when it was introduced for user enrollment, BYO, iOS, and iPadOS devices. Last year at WWDC 2022, it became available for all devices and enrollment types, and that's when stuff starts to get cool, because now the use case is so much broader, which means MDMs benefit so much more from enabling the protocol. The first general assertion that Apple recommended is around the status subscriptions for key inventory updates. That is a major benefit for admins, and let me explain why. This is an example of XML response that you might get from a traditional MDM device query. So as an admin, if I'm worried about security and compliance, by the way, I'm going to say the word security and compliance a few times. I'm not going to even apologize for it. I know that my managed devices staying up to date with a fully patched OS is one of the most important things that I can do to protect my organizational data. So I send the command, and we just got an update today. Send the command for devices to update. But afterwards, rather than sending that frequent, overly verbose, send me your entire inventory query, we just have a declaration and a status subscription that says, when this particular value changes, alert my management server to the change. So instead of that full XML, now we just have a single statement that says, my new operating system is 16.5.1 as of today. And then with that single sparse value update, that device record gets updated. The management server can do whatever additional processing it might need in regard to remediation workflows or restricting or enabling access to organizational data, that kind of thing. And that speaks to several key real-world use cases, especially ones from highly compliant environments. And this is a real use case that a customer I spoke to last year. Imagine you have a completely remote field staff, all using iPhones with in-house apps, and a mandated requirement to only permit access to organizational data if the devices are within a compliance threshold of their OS version. Basically, you have to stay up to date to continue accessing organizational data. And you might even have a non-compliance device jail workflow where organizational resources are locked out to force end users to perform that update. Okay. So they do the update. Cool. Then what? Well, you might be waiting. With traditional legacy MDM, you might be still sitting in device jail for some period of time until the inventory actually completes an update. Or maybe you've got a tool, first or third party, that uses an API command to send a few of those overly verbose, very chatty MDM updates to update the device record information and force, we'll say, a smart group recalculation. Or maybe you call the help desk and make some poor person on the IT line actually do those tools to force the update and the recalculation. Or, with this brand new flavor of MDM, you've already defined the behavior to the device by way of a declaration. The device already knows when your OS changes, alert the management server. And the management server is just subscribed to that field, just waiting, just tell me when something has changed. And when it receives that change, it can recalculate smart group population if that's required. It can handle any compliance or unlock, relock, whatever the requirements are as far as distributing that content back to the device. And that communication would be minimal. We're back to the single value. It would only be required when that value actually changes on the device. And I'm putting an asterisk at the end of that statement because we've discovered some things. So I'll get back to that in just a minute. But the ideal state is the device only shares the status change when it's changed. So I'm going to talk about some real-world use cases, including this one that came to me from an admin who might have had some spoilers for WWDC. The admin said, I can't wait to handle certificates with declarations. And that's one of the nerdiest things I've ever heard in my life. So this admin works in a large global organization. And like I said, may have had some spoilers about WWDC this year, because we did, in fact, get declarative support for certificate payloads. We'll explore that a little bit later on, but I want to start with his why. Why did he care about this? Why is this something that he bothered to tell me on a phone call? So, as I mentioned, admin, large global organization with a lot of different end user use cases, a whole bunch. And one of the ones that he's worried about is warehouse workers that are in remote locations where network throughput is super limited. And he joked about how his InfoSec team actually prides itself on creating really, really complex certificate payloads. And you can imagine those payloads are pretty large. So think about the latency that you're inviting in that environment when you switch user authentication context at the beginning or an end of a shift. Think about multiplying that by hundreds, maybe thousands of transactions. Those people, all of whom are authenticating, maybe having to do multi-factor, all hitting nearby access points, all hitting a management server that is probably nowhere near local, and that management server is in itself actually hitting certificate infrastructure that's probably even less local. So in a large organization like this one, those large certificate payloads that they're struggling with are probably really duplicative. The same certificates, the same identities, over and over. And with legacy MDM certificate deployment, by configuration profile, you just can't refer to a certificate that's already been delivered by another payload, even if it literally is the exact same certificate. Profile payloads aren't allowed to refer to other payloads. But imagine, what if you could break up those duplicative certificates into assets that could be declared on the device and then used by multiple configurations? Now, I'll revisit this a little bit when I get to WWDC, but keep in mind the why of this admin was so interested in something that could optimize this workflow. Fundamentally, what he's looking for is a reduction in network latency for clients that are switching user contexts. We're kind of building on the theme, right? give the device more context up front with complex instructions, then provide user rules about how it should behave moving forward. You offer way more trust and require way less communication from that device. And of course I say that, but now I get to the part where new things are hard and they don't always go the way we expect. So I mentioned an asterisk about status values a couple slides back, and that status update should only occur when you've actually seen a change in that value. And so this quote comes to you by a senior software engineer at Jamf who slacked me out of the blue one day and said, "We've noticed that devices are checking in a lot more often with status updates than we expect them to, at least daily, even if the status fields themselves aren't changing value." And then he shared over this graph, which is a bit of an eye chart, so let me explain what you're seeing here. It shows a really interesting repeating and consistent pattern of communication day over day in one of our hosted clusters. You can almost follow the sun with the pattern that we're seeing as far as distribution and frequency of those reports. And I want to be clear, this is still under investigation. And as I'm saying this right this second on stage, I don't know whether this is a protocol issue or an implementation issue, and we're still digging into it. But I can say that we track the volume and frequency of legacy MDM responses separately, and they are orders of magnitude larger and more frequent than what we're seeing here. Despite involving roughly the same number of managed clients, not all of those clients have updated to an OS that supports declarative management, so it's not a one-to-one correlation. But what we're seeing here is a representation of unexpected client behavior. What we're not seeing is resulting server instability or command latency or instance unavailability or a spike in calls to the help desk. This is effectively background noise. And why is this important? Well, it kind of tells you two things about declarative management. One, it's really new, and we're still learning how it all works under the covers. And two, it actually really does do what it says on the tin. It reduces that MDM polling and minimizes the required communication between the client and the server, even if it's a little more frequent than we're expecting. If this were traditional MDM inventory spamming our servers, I wouldn't be mentioning it as a point of curiosity. I'd be buying the engineers donuts so they could put out the fire. But the moral of the story is, even when it doesn't work as expected, it's still a massive improvement. So with that discovery in mind, let's talk about some of the problems that we are quite used to with legacy MDM, particularly at scale, and how those problems will just kind of start to go away. First, it's worth explaining this comment, which is, oh, but the thundering herd events will be a problem. This is from a coworker of mine in Jamf support, and we were chatting about product improvements, and they mentioned that they actually anticipated a different flavor of support problem from the new protocol. So let me explain. The thundering herd is a colloquial term that we use at Jamf to talk about high volume client events. That could be the beginning of the school year with a lot of app downloads. It could be the morning after a holiday weekend when everybody opens up their laptop and gets back to work. It could be a mass deployment event. Basically, we're describing a whole lot of clients hitting their management server for one reason or another. It could be inadvertently triggered by a mass action or even a policy gone wrong. In any case, my coworker was anticipating that status updates would somehow build up, like over a long holiday weekend, for example. And once devices woke up and connected to the internet, they would clobber the management server with that new flavor of communication. Now, I'll be honest, this was a little puzzling to me because we had just gotten through all the benefits of minimal polling, just status updates when something changes. How many changes are actually likely to stack up over a weekend? This point and the previous one about unexpected status updates are actually related. We are still discovering the real-world implications of moving to an autonomous device management model. But as expressed in the intent and the design of the protocol, we should actually anticipate a significant reduction in these sort of predictable mass events. So 1,000 kids open their laptops in homeroom at 8:05 a.m. and everything immediately slows to a crawl. We don't expect that anymore. This also relates to the earlier point about certificate management. And with broader adoption of the protocol and more mature workflows as offered by Apple, admins will have the ability to stage complex, computationally expensive, or bandwidth-heavy workflows well before the device actually needs to perform or apply them. not strictly at the time the device is told to request them. Now, selfishly, from a product perspective, this is going to be a fun challenge to figure out how we represent those potential and not yet actual activation states for admins. Maybe a device isn't behaving as expected, but maybe that's because a predicate wasn't defined or an activation state simply hasn't been reached yet. What does that look like? How do we troubleshoot it? That's going to be super interesting to unpack in the next few years. Another thing that we're going to benefit from is better controls over security. And you're not going to be able to read that. That is okay, because you may have seen some representation of this in your IT life in regard to applying security controls. And somebody just sends out a spreadsheet and says, you have to do these. Okay, so here's a bunch of controls. They're probably Windows-centric. If there are exceptions, they might have to be handled by some cross-system automation and approval. And what's worse is actually trying to build reporting or remediation based on some patched together individual complex framework of controls. Maybe one group in your organization gets admin access. Maybe another group gets access to modify the sudoers file. Maybe you allow temporary admin rights to certain services based on a logged and authorized request. All these things are doable in traditional frameworks, but they tend to be brittle and require some significant care and feeding when any OS change modifies the underlying service behavior. And that's not a one-time expense, right? This, you can't just deploy settings and be sure that they're okay. There's continuous evaluation, continuous reporting, continuous remediation, and that stuff that gets really tedious and expensive. So consider instead a future when you can compose a set of compliance requirements, declare them on a device, enable predicates that permit the device to autonomously permit or restrict changes based on conditions, whether that's your user role, your presence on a corporate network, or some calculation of your client's security posture. So the thundering herde's going to start going extinct. Hopefully these spreadsheets will go away. These are the worst. But the problems that go away with declarative management aren't just benefits for raw network throughput and calculation on a management server. It's not just about the numbers, but the assurance that a device is actually behaving within the parameters you've defined and that it'll tell you when something has changed very quickly. So that's why I get excited about declarative management, because the opportunities are endless to improve existing workflows, and the things that we'll be able to do to enable admins to serve end users will make IT look like magicians, and it's going to be awesome. Okay. So those are interesting things that people have said to me about declarative management. And now, because WWDC was just a couple weeks ago, I have some things to say about it. So I will go ahead and dig into that. That guy who wanted certificate management is going to be happy. I was like, oh, when that session came up, I was like, that dude's going to be excited about that. So I mentioned it already, that we are getting declarative support for certificates and identities. And now we're going to be able to declare certificates as assets that can be used by multiple configurations. So think about those complex payloads where you're delivering the same certificate and identity over and over for each user. Now you only have to deliver it once and reference by identity configurations. A couple other benefits we get from the declarative workflow. Self-signed certificates will add the certificate authority to the device's trusted root certs. And now we can configure mail and exchange to use S-MIME. So that's pretty cool. This is another thing that I'm saying about declarative management. I can't wait for better end user interactions and notifications. And honestly, one of the coolest things that we got out of WWDC, and like it delights me to be this nerdy about it, software updates, yes. We're actually starting to see what client behavior could actually look like with end user notification and declarations. So software updates, not only do admins have the option to initiate an update that designates a version and a local client time to enforce that version, but end users actually get built-in client-side notifications and interaction of what's happening and what they can expect when that enforcement event happens. They can preempt enforcement by electing to update ahead of the target time, either right at that second or by scheduling it with local client logic. This is all without extra agents. It's pretty cool. If a user defers, they get local notifications with increasing frequency as the deadline approaches. And if they straight up missed the deadline because the device was offline or powered off or whatever, once it comes back online, it'll handle its own catch-up logic to enforce the update within 1 hour after coming back online. This is awesome. I definitely recommend watching the session Explore Advances in Declarative Management in the WWDC videos this year, so you can actually see the screenshots and what it's going to look like for end users. I'm a big fan. Okay, I have mentioned security and compliance. I think I should have a swear jar for the number of times I say that. That's a frequent topic, and I've briefly touched on the notion of reporting and remediating when a user with local admin privileges makes a change to some low-level service. I've mentioned how tedious an admin task that is. It's very expensive to maintain compliance over time. But coming up, you'll be able to use declarations to simply configure tamper resistance to those low-level services without having to chase individual detections. Related to that, a management server can also subscribe to status notifications about specific background tasks. And I'll be honest, that actually sounds like we're back to talking about individual detections again, but hopefully it's actually more valuable in this context. So you can do things like monitor whenever a critical security agent has gone offline, stopped functioning, or potentially you can listen to see if a known malicious agent has started running on a system. And again, we're talking about autonomous client action, so your management server would just be listening, tell me when something changes, and not repeatedly polling to discover everything happening on the device at any given second, and then trying to parse out all the meaningful bits from the fire hose. When you can listen for the individual changes that are meaningful to your organization, you're only reacting to the things that your organization cares about, and not the myriad of other things that wander around on a client during daily use. One last declarative highlight this year is in regard to app installation, which again is directly tied to kind of optimizing that end user experience, right? Like with software update notifications. Can your end user do the things they need to do when they need to do them? Or are they sitting around waiting for an app to download over a saturated Wi-Fi? Declarations aren't going to fix saturated Wi-Fi, but with predicates based on the user of a device in a given context, you can define sets of apps that are available or not. So in essence, you can still stage all the apps that the device will ever need and then activate them when a user context requires it. They can indicate whether the app is required or optional, so an end user can go ahead and download it if that's appropriate. But it's a thematically consistent feature of app management with declarative management, using declarations as a status update for app installation. It's another example of kind of distilling the most important information that's happening in a device communication. Tell me when a mission critical app has been removed. Tell me immediately. Tell me when a small set of defined enterprise applications has been installed and the device is ready for use. Tell the management server as soon as an app with a known vulnerability has been patched so that I can share that with security tooling that's elsewhere in my enterprise. So this is one of those highly common reactive security and compliance workflows where we can reduce the timeline between known problem, deployed resolution, and then we know it's resolved. We don't have to ask everything from the device all the time. We just tell the device to tell us when the stuff we care about has changed. So we'll bring this all together. Why will your data center love declarative management? Well, it radically changes how we communicate with managed devices by allowing us to send out complex instructions and conditions that allow the device to behave autonomously rather than reactively by checking in with its management server over and over. But that's not all. InfoSec teams are going to love declarative management because of the confidence that we get by applying those settings and the near immediate status reporting we get when some value or condition that we particularly care about has changed on the device. And end users are going to appreciate the way that we can build better interactions in terms of scheduling events or removing latency when devices are switching contexts. This is going to be like a cool whole package eventually. It's a slow roll, but we're getting there. And that's it. So thank you.